Thank you very much for that kind introduction, perhaps a little overkind. I'm vice chairman of the Expert Advisory Group. Now, it would be overstating it to say it's the organising committee, but it's, shall we say, the body to which people turn if they want, say, the historical accuracy of something checked, or a view of what's the most balanced way of doing things. And obviously, in reference to the Good Friday Agreement, I suppose there would be a whole team of people who would have contributed to various formulations, but yes, I'm sure I played my bit as well. I must say it's a great tribute to people in this audience that they're actually sitting here on the afternoons here. I think people who organise summer schools, don't really expect summer when it's actually held, But anyway, I'd like to begin by saying a few words about your distant patron, Oliver Goldsmith. I've always been fond of Oliver Goldsmith and Goldsmith country, and he spent some of his late teenage years here in Ballymun and occasionally expressed a wish to retire here. His gentle public persona belies the fact that his life was full of trials and tribulations and adventures, and in his writings, most notably in his poem The Deserted Village, he certainly challenged the existing order. And its most famous lines are still from time to time quoted in an Irish political context today when the problem of growing inequality is discussed. Ill fares the land to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. But that was not his only radical line. In his poem, The Traveller, he complained, laws grind the poor and rich men rule the law. He often struggled to survive in London despite his talent as a writer, being, as he wrote to his brother-in-law back in Ireland, in a country where my being born an Irishman was sufficient to keep me unemployed. Like many in the arts community today, he was dissatisfied with the level of interest of the Irish governing elite in supporting the arts. In a new book, Brothers of the Quill, Oliver Goldsmith in Grub Street, just published by Harvard, Norma Clark of Kingston University in England writes, based on another letter to his brother-in-law, Goldsmith also lamented that money did not go to men of letters, the Irish elite preferring to spend on horses than give rewards to learned men, with the inevitable result in cultural impoverishment. In his famous still-played comedy of 1773, She Stoops to Conquer, where two London gentlemen are led a merry dance by Tony Lumpkin, who plays the country yokel, one of them, Marlowe, complains when all is revealed that he would be laughed at all over town. I shall be stuck up in caricatura in all the print shops, the Dullissimo Macaroni. Earlier this year, the Chester Beatty Library put on an exhibition called Wicked Wit, Darley's comic prints from the early 1770s, which featured among dozens of prints 6 macaroni prints, where the figure is deliberately distorted, by a young man in his early 20s of my family, though not a direct ancestor, Richard St. George Mansergh. Just as in Goldsmith's case, for many of the 1916 leaders, and notably both Pearse and Connolly, whose reputations prior to the Rising were in good part projected by their writings and speeches, financial struggles took up too much of their energies. In considering how far the Easter Rising should be considered a cultural rising, there are 3 issues to be dealt with. First, how far and how soon did contemporaries see it in that light? Then one must consider the critics of 1916, including some of the surviving revolutionaries who considered that an altogether different approach would be required when the struggle was renewed. Today's critics, in many cases, come from another direction and use the literary and artistic background of many of the leaders to argue that Irish independence was based on wholly fanciful economic ideas that left Ireland trailing its European neighbours till 1960, if not 1990, with the question mark as to whether Irish independence was worthwhile at all. A lot of revolutions were preceded and inspired by cultural and intellectual ferment. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment inspired the American and the French revolutions, which remained from the early 1790s to 1916 the principal models for an Irish revolution. It has long been a dominant historical theme that after the fall of Parnell, nationalists turned away from parliamentary politics and became immersed in a cultural awakening. There was both the Irish Ireland movement, comprehending the GAA, founded in Thurles in 1884, the Gaelic League, founded in 1892, and the associated Irish language revival. Complementary to that, but sometimes seen in competition to it, was the more general literary or Celtic revival, centring around the poetry of Yeats and the Abbey Theatre. Historians need to be just a little cautious. Literary people who are gifted writers, by definition, leave a written record, generally speaking, articulate and persuasive, which deliberately or not can create an overstated impression of their influence at the time, which in turn enhances their subsequent reputations. A classic example of this comes from one of Yeats's last poems, The Man and the Echo, about the impact of his play Kathleen na Houlihan. Did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot? And when he was a member of the Irish Free State Senate, he referred with, I think, false modesty in April 1923, the month the Civil War ended, to quote, "When we began our imaginative movement, which for good or ill had a little share in bringing about recent events." Conversely, the two 1916 leaders who were most influential in bringing about the Rising, both in a sense Leitrim men, were Tom Clarke and Sean McDermott, neither of whom left behind a body of writings, literary or otherwise, though the formidable Kathleen Clarke in later life wrote memoirs edited and published by her great-niece Helen Lytton in 1991. This brings into sharp focus the theme of this conference, is the pen mightier than the sword? Fergal McGarry, in his fine book, The Abbey Rebels of 1916, A Lost Revolution, quotes Michael Collins saying impatiently, and I quote, "Looking at it from the inside, I was in the GPO, it had the air of a Greek tragedy about it." That remark was not, I think, intended as a compliment. McGarry comments, justly in my view, and I quote, "Collins had a better understanding of military strategy than of the power of myth." The dichotomy is at the heart of the Rising itself. When the German arms failed to be landed and Roger Casement was captured, the leader of the Irish Volunteers, Owen McNeill, perhaps using it as an excuse, called off the Rising on Easter Sunday because he judged the situation to be militarily hopeless. For partly the same reason, Casement had come back in a German submarine to warn the leaders that there was no prospect of substantial German military help, even assuming the arms were successfully landed. James Connolly, in particular, who led the army of the Irish Republic into the GPO on Easter Monday, was well aware that the military prospects were nil, and according to some accounts, but I just haven't succeeded in finding a reliable source, predicted that they would all be slaughtered. But as far as those who wanted to proceed, notwithstanding McNeill's countermanding order, that was not the point. The point was the need to make a sacrifice. Since the failed Fenian Rising of 1867, advanced nationalists had waited for 2 generations for an opportunity that would be created by British participation in an international conflict that required it to remove most of its army for Ireland for more active duty elsewhere. It is not clear who first coined the maxim, "England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity." It is attributed second-hand after his death to Daniel O'Connell, and its first application, obviously, was the extraction of legislative independence by Grattan's Parliament in 1782, immediately following the shock to Britain of the loss of America. John Redmond, who was also quoted from this period by Brown this morning, John Redmond invoked this in 1898, the centenary of the 1798 rebellion, when he was still the leader of the Parnellite faction before the split closed, and at a time when he still relied on Old Fenian support. Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, who was decidedly hot-headed, did not hold much store by it, on the grounds that it was an excuse for doing nothing, and that if war did eventually come, the likelihood was that it would be over before anything would be done. Terence McSweeney, in the autumn of 1914, as author of a court-produced anti-war bulletin called Fianna Fáil, after the insignia in the cap of the Irish Volunteers, wrote that Ireland should realise that the war would result in remaking of the map of Europe, that Ireland's place would depend on her readiness to fight for it, and that place must be her recognition as a nation amongst the nations. The influence of Robert Emmet on Patrick Pearse was also very strong, St Enda's School being located in the Hermitage, which had once belonged to Sarah Curran's father. The point of the rising was to state and demonstrate a claim, or to use a terminology that we are no longer comfortable with, to make a blood sacrifice. Despite the somewhat chaotic nature of the military proceedings, as the historian Charles Townshend has commented, and I quote, "Amazingly out of it all emerged the most potent military action ever mounted by Irish rebels." This, of course, takes into account not just the rebellion itself, but the British military reaction to it, based on the illusion that if this was sufficiently stern, such an event could never happen again. As a devotee of Emmet, as the person who delivered the famous oration at the graveside of O'Donovan Rossa, Pearse knew exactly what the effect of martyrdom would be, and to be doubly certain of it, he added a postscript to a letter to his mother on the 1st of May 1916, expressing his regret that the German help he had been counting on would not get through, being absolutely certain that this letter would immediately come to the attention of the authorities. And Tom Clark's one fear, having spent an appalling number of years in prison under harsh conditions, was that he would not be shot. Pearse was designated Commander-in-Chief, but there is relatively little evidence of his military activity in the GPO, unlike Connolly, apart from his participation in the decision to surrender and taking full responsibility for it. Of course, Pearse's forte was writing. He was immensely proud of the proclamation, which was mainly his work, and indeed one of his visitors during Easter week noted that he seemed to be more interested in how the public were reacting to the proclamation than in the progress of the fighting. At the end of it, he was dismayed by the destruction and loss of civilian life, but fairly confident about what had been achieved. It might seem that the proclamation was the principal legacy of the rising from today's standpoint. Actually, it was the dynamic that it set off, which led a few years later to an independent Irish state, even if it did not cover the whole island. During the Irish Revolution, taken as a whole, both the pen and the sword were required, and one without the other would have been of limited value. Pearce, in a final speech in the GPO on the evening of Friday the 28th of April, brought the two together when paying homage to the gallantry of the soldiers of Irish freedom, quote, who have during the past 4 days been writing with fire and steel the most glorious chapter in the later history of Ireland. Moira Regan, a young woman from County Wexford who was a member of Cumann na mBan and who spent most of Easter week at the GPO when not carrying messages to other outposts in the city, gave a lengthy interview in August 1916 about her experiences to Joyce Kilmer of the New York Times Magazine, a city to which she had since moved. She said many interesting things about the absolute equality of men and women in the GPO and the fact that the Rising had made the imposition of conscription impossible, or as we know with the benefit of the hindsight, at least pro tem. And I want to quote the core of what she said, and this is her speaking. But the greatest result of the Rising, the thing that will justify it, even if it were the only good result, is the complete and amazing revival of Irish nationality. We have been living in a country that had no national life, and suddenly we were shown we had a national life. We were a province and now we're a nation. We were British subjects and now we're Irish. That is what the Rising of Easter week had done for Ireland. And this interview is contained in a new book by Robert Schmuhl of the University of Notre Dame called Ireland's Exiled Children, America and the Easter Rising. 4 of the 7 signatories of the proclamation were writers and poets. Pearce, MacDonagh, Plunkett, and though only occasionally a writer of poetry, Connolly. Eamon Cant was also a writer, though the most prolific of the 16 executed by a long way was Roger Casement. Pearce wrote some good poetry, for example, on the trials of mothers while he was awaiting execution, but also these telling lines: "O wise men, riddle me this, what if the dream come true? What if the dream come true, and if millions shall dwell in the house that I shaped in my heart, the noble house of my thought?" By the middle of May 1916, only a week after the last executions, barring Casement, a very critical source, writing under the biblical pseudonym Shebna the Scribe in the Church of Ireland Gazette, had grasped that, and I quote, "the 1916 rebels were chiefly young intellectuals, professional and university men of literary distinction." And by the following month it was clear to the Gazette that Pearce and Connolly were taking their place in the pantheon with Emmet and Tone. There were other arts associated with the Rising. Constance Markovich was an amateur painter. Willie Pearce, like his father, was a sculptor. And many performing artists, especially from the Abbey Theatre, took part in the Rising. It is difficult to think of any later Irish leaders that had a deeper knowledge of history than Patrick Pearse and Owen McNeill. Well, I can think of one possible exception, but from the Unionist tradition, David Trimble has also written quite a bit on history, but from a different angle. And he wrote a pamphlet on the Easter Rising. Now, this was before he became leader of the Ulster Unionist Party. And he was quite critical of the British, and basically the mistake the British made was they didn't shoot half enough people. In his book, Vivid Faces, Roy Foster has explored the hopes and aspirations of many of those who formed part of the cultural milieu that was a backdrop to the Rising. Revolutions invariably end in disappointment for many. In his autobiography, written before he became German president, Joachim Gauck, who was a Lutheran pastor at the centre of the peaceful revolution in the German Democratic Republic, in the autumn of 1989, which led to the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, has written, and I quote, "Freedom as a longed-for aspiration had a power of attraction and undiminished beauty. Freedom as reality is not just happiness, but also tribulation." And of course we know this. When a country wins its independence, it doesn't mean that everyone lives happily ever after. Far from it. It has responsibilities, many of them that it wouldn't have had before. And while you have your successes and progress that you're very pleased with, you also have setbacks and crises and disasters, and that's the life of nations. And ideals of revolution before it happens, they can tend to be a bit utopian, a bit millenarian. So, disappointment is written into it, and you couldn't find a revolution anywhere in the world where, say, a few decades after, everyone or most people were entirely happy that it had fulfilled its original ideals. And one could say that in the case of the Irish Revolution, much of the idealism was front-loaded. In truth, while the cultural drive to independence was important, there were other factors at work. Thomas Kent came from a land war background, Connolly from a labour movement one. The opportunity to stage a rising came not only from the war, but from the Ulster Unionists' determination to resist Home Rule, including their willingness to drill and import arms illegally, which made it relatively easy, particularly pre-August 1914, for nationalist volunteers to do likewise. While those who survived the rising or who joined the volunteers later, while they all honoured the rising, they had no disposition to follow them. Purposes narrowed. Collins's speech over the grave of hunger striker Thomas Ashe was terse, and at the very opposite end of the register to Pearse's speech over the grave of O'Donovan Rossa. As Oliver St. John Gogarty was developing some elaborate verbal spiel at a dinner, he was cut short by Collins. "Your point, Mr. Gogarty." Intellectuals and revolutionary women became much distrusted. Women's equality was, for a long time, limited to the franchise. The cultural purposes of independence came to centre on the Irish language, Celtic civilization, including, of course, Gaelic games, on the one hand, and on establishing and vindicating the mainly Catholic character of the new state. A vigilant censorship attempted to keep alien influences as much as possible at bay. If Eastern Europe post-1945 was soon protected by an Iron Curtain, Ireland, to adapt a phrase of Sean Lemass in the 1960s, was protected by a Green Curtain. Both Kevin O'Higgins and Eamon de Valera accepted that they were conservative revolutionaries. There remained, of course, an alternative and somewhat dissident culture, which neither church nor state were able entirely to suppress, that came into its own in a later, more liberal Ireland. And Irish culture today, in its many diverse forms, is one of the strengths and attractions of the country. And we have the first poet in the Irish since Douglas Hyde. There is a tendency among some economic historians and commentators to be highly critical of Ireland's economic performance till quite recently, and to rather overstate the relative welfare of Ireland coming up to 1914. This ignores the appalling housing situation in inner city Dublin, rural poverty, and the steady fall in population throughout the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And in the highly disrupted conditions of the interwar years, followed by the destruction of the Second World War, meaningful comparisons between European countries are difficult. Ireland succeeded in maintaining its democracy and independence, and over time developed an economy quite different in character from what would have been its trajectory if it had remained a region of the UK, devolved or not. Living in an era of benign and friendly British-Irish relations, which we hope will continue after the Brexit referendum on the 23rd of June, it is difficult to imagine the obstacles faced 100 years ago. Lloyd George, British Prime Minister, spelt them out in October 1917, and I quote, and he was speaking in the House of Commons. "There is a good deal of talk in Ireland among Sinn Féiners which does not mean Home Rule. It means complete separation and secession. The word which is used is sovereign independence. This country," by which he meant Britain, "could not possibly accept that under any conditions. It is not a question of whether it is to be in the form of a republic. The point is that there is a demand for sovereign independence for Ireland, and it is better that we should say at once that under no conditions can this country possibly permit anything of that kind." End of quote. Independence of any kind was not easily achieved and was not in any way inevitable. Britain looked on its neighbouring island in a quite different strategic light from its far-flung dominions, and that's a point that Brian made this morning. When it came to culture, Oliver Goldsmith preferred home. I quote, "If I go to the opera where Signora Columba pours out all the verses of melody, I sit and sigh for a Lissoy fireside and Jimmy Austen's Last Good Night for Peggy Golding." Cultural distinctiveness, indicative of a separate nationality, was a key driver of independence. But without the Rising and what followed, it would have remained aspirational. Conversely, a mere revolt could always be easily suppressed, but not when combined with a strong national spirit and a culture that had a presence and empathy in many kindred countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Ladies and gentlemen, what a lucid and comprehensive account that is of the context of the 1916 Rising, and also a wonderful synthesis with the philosophy and thinking of our patron, Oliver Goldsmith. Now, I'm sure Dr. Mansergh would take some questions, if there are any, starting now. We've got some time, yes? Yes.
What would have happened had they not executed the men of the GPO?
That's a very good question. Now, being what historians would call a counterfactual question, naturally enough, it can't be answered with any great authority. The Augustin Birrell, who was the chief secretary who left in disgrace because he hadn't foreseen and stopped the 1916 Rising, in a sort of parting shot, warned his colleagues something to the effect that this is not an Irish Rising, we should not make it one. And of course that's precisely what they did. I think a lot of nationalists were unhappy with the contrasting treatment. There was a revolt in South Africa known as the Tibet Rebellion at the beginning of the First World War. And there was only one person executed who was a defector from the state side to Tibet. So Tibet and his colleagues, none of them were shot. And the argument was made at the time, and it's in Dorothy McArdle's Irish Republic, why did the British not do that? Now, in admittedly quite different circumstances, in 1848, that's the Smith-O'Brien Rebellion in the home country of Tipperary. Now, there were only a couple of casualties, and they were civilian ones, but nobody, while people were sentenced to death, they were actually transported to Australia, Van Diemen's Land, etc. So it really wasn't very good. But Maxwell was under quite a lot of pressure. Now, we're conscious of, because we're looking at it with the benefit of hindsight, Asquith saying after a few days, you need to go easy. But in the immediate aftermath of the Rising, there were the opposite pressures. Now, I think we know about the glorious or inglorious record of the Irish Times and Irish Independent, both of which wrote editorials, urging stern measures and cutting out cancers and all this sort of thing. And it's clear from going through publications like the Church of Ireland Gazette and statements by the Church of Ireland Archbishop of Dublin is, we have to put a stop to this nonsense once and for all, make sure it could never happen again, etc. Now, within a few months, they realised that was all illusion, and hoping that General Maxwell wouldn't be in any way deterred from taking, the maximum sternness. But there's no doubt that the executions, but along also with... See, another thing that happened in the middle of the executions, and it was mentioned this morning, the shooting dead of Francis Sheehy Skeffington and a couple of, I think, journalists with him that sort of cast a light over the whole thing and just emphasised the arbitrariness. Now, as we know, the trials were just simply pro forma, basically, and they were all accused of trying to assist the enemy, and the vast majority, if not all of them, helping Germany was not even a peripheral part of their agenda, let alone a main part of it. But yeah, if they had adopted a different approach, you see, again, they would have been subject to domestic political pressures. Remember, the British shot somewhere, I don't have the exact figure in my head, but somewhere in the region of 300 deserters, the so-called shot at dawn thing is, and I think they were, among other things, worried about criticism. Well, you're shooting people who have attacks of nerves or whatever at the front, and yet you're letting people, rebellion, who talk about gallant allies in Europe, you're letting them off. And incidentally, that was one instance where the Germans, they only shot about between 45 and 50 of their troops during the entire war. They have a better record than the British and French by a considerable margin on that. But anyway, that's just a side issue. But no, I think if there hadn't been the executions, then reactions to things might have been different. But of course, the large number of people sort of shipped abroad, whether they had taken part or not, to prison camps in Britain, Clongowk and other places, that also had an impact because, everybody in prison, they had family, they had friends, and so on. And then there's also the politics of it. After the Rising, there was an urgent political initiative, as often happens after something like a Rising takes place, and Lloyd George sort of cobbled together a sort of a draft agreement. I wouldn't call it more than a draft agreement between Redmond and Carson, which allowed Home Rule to come in soon, but on a partitionist basis, the 6 counties to be cordoned off, and that caused a lot of disillusion, particularly among nationalists, because you see, up until then, the front had been maintained is Home Rule isn't going to involve partition, and so on.
Thank you. Anne.
Briefly, just like to compliment you on that lovely synthesis at the end, that the cultural nationalism was I suppose, the force that brought the revolution over what might have disappeared within a week or forgotten within a fortnight or 3 weeks after the executions. The fact that there was a climate of cultural nationalism that had been growing for the previous 10, 15 years allowed that spirit of the province, the nation, to take place.
Well, I think one of the... sorry, your question?
It wasn't...
Oh, well, just a comment. Yeah, I mean, one of those kind of hidden things that isn't much referred to in the history books is, if you look at things from the unionist side, there were unionist writers and ideologues, say, 1904, times like that, who was sort of saying boldly, there is no such thing as Irish nationality. Or if there is, there are two Irish nations. And so I think this gave an added spur to people to say, well, hang on, there is, and if you like, to emphasise the distinctive features. But I mean, even for people like Yeats and the Abbey movement, it was about creating a national theatre, not so much a nationalist theatre, but a national theatre, and so on, and to develop. I would think of 1916 and what followed. It was about creating a national life of our own, and that is really what I took from that woman, Moira Regan. And I think the net effect of the Rising and what happened afterwards was just to reinforce people's determination. You see, the political alternative was Home Rule. Now, they first of all tried to get 26-county Home Rule going. That was the Lloyd George initiative. That fell both because nationalists withdrew their agreement, but also because Southern Unionists, realising this would leave them a small minority, objected strongly. So then in the Irish Convention of 1917-18, which brought together all the constitutional parties but not Sinn Féin, in effect the Southern Unionists were trying to persuade the Ulster Unionists, along with nationalists, to look at the original Home Rule, 32-county Home Rule. Wouldn't this be better than partition? But I'm afraid the Ulster Unionist answer was no. But one of the things that is very little known, and certainly wasn't known about in 1974, at the time of the Sunningdale Agreement, was that Carson did throw a sop called the Council of Ireland, to do certain things that were best done on an all-Ireland basis as an alternative to accepting Home Rule. But come the 1970s, I don't think anybody from any side remembered that was the origin of the idea. And of course, it went into the Government of Ireland Act and the treaty, and then it became a dead letter. And the Irish Free State wasn't very interested in it. So when, at the time of the boundary agreement in 1925, when Craig said, "Oh, well, look, we don't need any of these institutions. Let's just sort of cooperate on a case-by-case basis," with the result is virtually nothing happened for the next 30, 40, 50 years.
Yes.
Sorry, I think this question will have to be taken with a slight whiff of tongue in cheek. But given the fact that you said about Ireland forming its own nation and all that, we've had 100 years at that. I think we've been very successful. We have developed. And given the fact that, I suppose, looking at where Britain has gone in the last 100 years, having spent the second half of the 20th century discovering that the great wasn't actually in Britain, and having been through and having finally, I suppose, reached the point where they're coping with the loss of an empire, do you think there's any appetite now for Ireland rejoining the Commonwealth left in 49?
I think the simple answer to that is no, but I'll elaborate on it. You see, the Commonwealth was supposed to be a voluntary organisation, and that was the way, it was sold to Canada, South Africa. It was kind of reworking of the British Empire. But the only involuntary member of the Commonwealth as a result of the treaty was Ireland. It was made a case of peace or war as to whether we were forced to be in it. Now, what is quite true is when you come to the 1940s, it was fairly vestigial. I think you will find that, say, in 47, 48, Irish civil servants attended one or two committees. I think 1932 was the last Commonwealth conference attended. Funny enough, De Valera went to that. That was in Ottawa. And I think he was privately critical of Costello for effectively sort of flouncing out. You see, there's a big irony in the fact that in April 1949, which was the month by legislation Ireland left the Commonwealth, India became a republic and stayed in the Commonwealth. And of course today there are more republics than there are dominions. But today, the Commonwealth is a fairly an organisation, even from a British point of view, a fairly peripheral significance. I certainly remember Tony Blair regarded attending Commonwealth conferences as a bit mature. I think you'll find that the royal family takes a different view, but I suppose what it was replaced with, or has been replaced with, is a close bilateral British-Irish relationship. But even back then, in 1952-53, the Common Travel Area, which is coming up in the Brexit debate a bit, that was formalised. So, if you like, you could call it almost a kind of mini Schengen, free movement between the two countries. And we just have to keep our fingers crossed to the other side of the 23rd and the 3rd of June as to see whether that. I think myself that we're in quite a strong position to argue that preceded EEC entry for either country. So I don't think our partners can simply dismiss it out of hand. But of course, it would be tiresome to have to be even making the argument for something that we nowadays take as self-evident. But no, to come back to the original question, and to be fair, you get, over the years I've been involved in discussions, you get the odd unionist, John Taylor in particular, particularly if they want to annoy nationalists, they will come out with saying, Ireland should rejoin the Commonwealth. But you see, quite leaving aside the Republican aspect of it, there would have been a fear, and I certainly found this, say in somewhere like the Department of Foreign Affairs, a fear that Ireland, by which I mean the Republic, rejoining the Commonwealth would send a kind of signal to European partners that we were in some way moving back into a sort of previous relationship. If and when there are negotiations on a united Ireland, on the assumption that the Commonwealth still exists at that time, who knows whether that will or won't be an issue. But I certainly detect very little public desire to go in that direction.
Seamus Heaney, towards the end of his life, I think, in an interview with the Times, put forward the view that it would never happen. He was as blank as that about it. It was the time, I think, of the dispute about the flying of the flag over City Hall in Belfast. He said each side had its entitlements, and he quoted, I think, McAteer, the Nationalist MP, who said that each side has its entitlements and one shouldn't interfere with them. And then I think Heaney went on to say that the Sinn Féin was wrong, and that in fact he felt that the United Ireland would never happen.
Well, that's a separate issue as to whether I would have a question mark as to, what the terms. And you see, if there were ever a United Ireland or negotiations for United Ireland, you have to remember both parts of the country have a vote on the matter. It's not just a majority in Northern Ireland; it has to be a majority here as well, and that would depend on the terms and conditions. And I think the experience of the Cyprus vote in 2004, when the Turkish Cypriots voted for UN proposals on unity, Turkish Cypriots having always opposed Cypriot unity, they supported it, but the Greek Cypriots, who had always supported Cypriot unity, they opposed these proposals, and therefore it fell. You see, one of the things that's written into the Downing Street Declaration, and more importantly the Good Friday Agreement, is that what operates in Ireland now, given we've been partitioned for 90 plus years, is to reunite the country, you need a majority in both parts of the country. That's what's called concurrent self-determination.
And Sinn Féin, I think, is pressing the urgency of a referendum, or the timeliness for a referendum. What do you think is it?
Well, it's in the discretion of the Secretary of State. It's both in her absolute discretion, but also in the specific circumstances where it looks as if there would be a majority for change. I can't see why, having got. I was up in Belfast earlier this week for the centenary of the Battle of Jutland, and I met the First Minister, and I couldn't resist saying that your government looks a bit more stable than the one south of the border. But anyway, what was I going to say? What was the question?
Well, you were talking about the right of the Minister of State or the Secretary of State.
Oh yes, the right of the Secretary of State to
when the time is propitious.
I can't see why, when they have got the executive focused on more practical issues, why you would want to send people back into the trenches when, as far as one can judge, there is no prospect of change. Now, you see, the interesting thing is not so much unionist opinion at the moment, but nationalist opinion. And I have a sense that I'm very distrustful of opinion polls in the North. They have a very, very mixed track record. But my feeling is that, after the crisis we've had here since 2008, Northern nationalists, taken as a whole, like St. Augustine, want unity, but perhaps not just yet. So I'm not really in favour now. I mean, the reason Sinn Féin makes that call, I mean, it's obviously an issue that is used to sort of motivate their base, and maybe they feel if we debated it more, it was more like, mind you, if the Brexit vote goes through in the sense of Britain deciding to leave the EU, I think you'll very quickly hear more calls of that kind, because I think what you will find is a fairly clear majority in Northern Ireland will vote to stay in the EU. The Sunday Times had a regionally broken down opinion poll last week which showed that there was actually a bigger majority in Northern Ireland even than in Scotland for staying. And it's very understandable because, and I talked to a couple of DUP people, should we say the DUP are not killing themselves trying to get an exit vote. It's just a position that helps to keep the party together. But you see, Northern Ireland is not actually in the same position as South East England. It's much more vulnerable to adverse economic impacts, arguably, than the southeast of England. And I think they're conscious that, you see, and there's this proposal that they want to carry through about reducing corporation tax to our level. But if Northern Ireland has left the EU, that won't have any impact at all, really.
Yes. One last question. Yes.
Is Ireland in danger of becoming, rural Ireland in danger of becoming called deserted villages?
No, I feel that's a bit over. I know what you mean. I feel that's a bit overstated. Now, it is quite true that, and it is a problem, villages, small villages particularly, perhaps losing the only shop they have, losing the post office, possibly losing the Garda station, and so on. And of course, rural broadband is dire. I mean, last week when I was in Tip one day, I couldn't get the broadband connection till about 6 p.m. in the evening, having had it on since about 10 or 11 in the morning. Now, I live 2 miles outside the town and about a mile from a sort of booster station on the edge of Tipperary town, but you know, it's not at all satisfactory. I mean, I do think that, you know, positive policies, you know, are needed. There's no point for, you'll get economists rather than say, sure, the population of Ireland, the Republic, is no more than that of Greater Manchester. Well, that's quite true. But, I mean, Ireland has a dispersed population over a very wide area which has nothing in common with Greater Manchester. I mean, you can't get from the end of the Dingle Peninsula to your local hospital at the same speed from a suburb of Manchester to the centre of Manchester. So, I mean, that's an absurd argument, and I don't have much sympathy with it. I mean, there are certain publications in this state that sort of kind of pander to the Dublin Evening Reader. No, we have to have a minister for Dublin. But, I mean, the government sits in Dublin. There are civil servants on every street. The likelihood of people being unaware of problems in Dublin compared with here or Tipperary or Kerry is absolutely minimal. So I mean, they're sure they have a government in Dublin and to a large extent for Dublin. So I really don't think sort of window dressing of a Minister of State for Dublin. I mean, that's a load of nonsense. I remember when I was in the Senate, a senator on the opposite benches saying to me sweetly, she was a woman, well, let's sort out the problems of Dublin first and then we'll deal with the rest of the country.
Yes, there was one last question you wanted to get in.
On about the 5th of May 1916, General Maxwell wrote to Bishop Edward O'Dwyer of Limerick,
yes,
complaining about the pro-nationalist activities of some priests.
yes.
And on the 10th of May, a reply to Maxwell was sent by the bishop in which he complained about the horrific treatment
Yes.
and reprisals by Maxwell.
And he sent that to the papers as well.
They went to the papers. Now, on the 12th of May,
Yes.
James Connolly was the last person to be executed, 16th. The Devilier was lined out, was number 17 on the list, and Maxwell is reputed to have asked a subordinate how important was Devilier, and he was told that.
The prosecutor Wiley, yes.
There's only no school teaching, no harm in him. So, I want to ask you, how influential do you think Bishop O'Dwyer's letter was in putting an end to the executions? I know at that time as well, Asquith had communicated with Maxwell, advising restraint because of the antiquity being aroused in America by the executions. But how influential was the Bishop's letter? And is this the case of a letter penned wielded by a crozier?
Well, now, I don't have the top of my head what date the letter was published. I think it was published after the executions. I think it was published in the middle of May, so it wouldn't have had an immediate effect. Now, Maxwell, to be fair, he would have had very little understanding of Irish political culture. I think it's a mistake to think that he was much influenced by what a Catholic bishop would say. Now, the bishop had a great influence on opinion in helping to shift public opinion, but I think his impact on Maxwell was probably next to nil. But undoubtedly, Asquith was beginning to get nervous, and he came across to Dublin. Now, Maxwell insisted on the last two executions, which from memory I think were James Connolly and Sean McDermott on the 12th. And you're right, he turned to William Wiley, who was the Crown Prosecutor, and asked him, this man De Valera, is he important? And the answer was no. And some versions also say, well, he's just a maths teacher in a school. Now, De Valera, to be fair to him, prior to the Rising, he had constantly, all his life, he was not greatly into secret organizations. He did his job as a volunteer, strictly military. He kept quite a low political profile. In fact, he didn't really have a profile much as far as, say, the police and soldiers. So that probably helped him to get off. And I think the American citizenship, that as a factor, has been rather discounted. But I'll just finish up with a nice anecdote about Asquith went to Richmond Barracks, which is where most of the prisoners, ordinary prisoners, were held. And to be fair to him, he went into the prison and he started talking to the volunteers. And there was one young Dublin volunteer, and he asked him, "And what do you think of the Rising now?" To which the reply was, "Well, sir, I think it was a great success." And so Asquith frowned and sort of effectively asked him, how can you possibly make that out? Well, if it weren't, sir, you wouldn't be here, would you?
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Martin Mansergh.